The blinding flash of red and blue lights painted streaks across the polished hood of my 1968 Mustang, reflecting a scene of pure, unadulterated absurdity. A police cruiser was angled awkwardly across the entrance to the park, and a young officer with a look of profound weariness was listening to a woman whose voice could curdle milk. That woman, the newly elected president of our homeowners association, was pointing a trembling, accusatory finger right at me. Me, sitting peacefully in the driver's seat of my own car in a park I happened to own. She had actually called 911 because I was trying to park. Her name was Clarissa, and she was about to learn that her tiny kingdom rested entirely on a foundation that I had personally built and could just as easily demolish. What do you think is the craziest thing an HOA has ever tried to enforce? Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because this story gets absolutely crazy. It all started, as these things so often do, with a desire for peace. My name is Alex, and my career is complicated. I'm a principal at a large-scale urban development firm. We don't just build houses. We build entire communities from the ground up. We buy massive tracts of land, we zone them, we lay the infrastructure, we design the parks and the commercial centers, and then we partner with builders to bring the vision to life. Harmony Creek Preserve was my masterpiece, my passion project for the better part of a decade. It was designed to be a modern idyllic village, a place with walkable green spaces, community centers, and a genuine sense of neighborhood. After spending years in boardrooms, dealing with contractors, and fighting with city councils to get it built, I decided I wanted to actually live in the world I had created. I bought a modest, quiet house on a cul-de-sac overlooking the Central Park I had personally sketched out on a napkin years earlier. All I wanted was to enjoy the fruits of my labor, to finally have a home instead of just a series of blueprints. And for a while, it was perfect. Then came Clarissa. I first heard her name in hushed, annoyed tones from neighbors. She and her husband had moved in about a year ago into one of the larger executive homes. She was younger than the typical HOA board president, somewhere in her late 20s, and possessed an unearned confidence that radiated from her like a toxic heat. She hadn't earned her place through community service or years of residency. She had seized it. The previous board had been a relaxed group of retirees who mostly just planned the annual barbecue. Clarissa saw a power vacuum and exploited it, campaigning on a platform of protecting our property values, which was really just a thinly veiled promise to harass anyone whose lawn was half an inch too long. She won by a handful of votes in a low-turnout election and immediately began her reign of terror. The initial decrees were minor but irritating. A specific shade of beige was now the only approved color for mailbox posts. Holiday decorations could not be erected more than 14 days prior to the holiday in question. Garbage bins, she mandated in a multi-paragraph email newsletter, could not be visible from the street for more than 3 hours before or after pickup. It was petty, micromanaging nonsense, but I was busy with work and content to ignore it. I paid my dues, kept my lawn neat, and focused on my own life. I failed to recognize the early signs of a tyrant consolidating her power. My mistake was underestimating her ambition. My passion outside of urban planning is classic cars. Specifically, my midnight blue 1968 Shelby GT500. It's a piece of American history, a rolling work of art. It took me years to restore it. The engine has a deep, throaty rumble that is, to my ears, a symphony. To Clarissa's ears, it was apparently a declaration of war. A few of my neighbors were also car enthusiasts, and we'd informally started a little Sunday morning tradition we called Cars and Coffee. We'd meet in the large, empty parking lot of the community park, chat for an hour, admire each other's vehicles, and then go our separate ways. It was harmless, quiet, and brought a few people together. That's when I received my first official notice. It was a crisp envelope in my mailbox, bearing the grandiose Harmony Creek Preserve HOA logo. Inside, a letter printed on heavy cardstock informed me that I was in violation of Bylaw 7.4c. No unauthorized commercial or group recreational activities shall be conducted on common grounds without prior written consent from the board. My friendly little car meetup, I was being fined $50. It was so ridiculous I almost laughed. I scanned the CC&RS, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that were included with my closing documents. I knew them intimately, of course, because my legal team and I had written every single word. I had crafted Bylaw 7.4c myself. It was intended to stop people from, say, running a full-blown commercial carnival or setting up a disruptive all-day sporting event without a permit. It was never meant to stop four friends from chatting over their cars for an hour. I fired off a polite explanatory email to the HOA board, assuming it was a simple misunderstanding from an overzealous new president. The response I got was a digital slap in the face. It was from Clarissa, and it was dripping with condescension. "Mr. Alex," it began, "while we appreciate your perspective, the board's interpretation of the bylaws is final. Your gathering attracts non-residents, and the noise from your vehicle is not in keeping with the tranquil atmosphere we strive to maintain. Please pay the fine promptly to avoid further action." That was the moment I knew this wasn't about rules. This was about power. My simple desire to enjoy my hobby in the very community I had designed for that purpose was a direct threat to her authority. I paid the $50 fine, a move I made not out of submission, but as a calculated strategic decision. It was bait. I wanted to see just how far she would push. I didn't have to wait long. The next Sunday, I drove the Mustang to the park alone. I wasn't meeting anyone. I just wanted to sit on a bench, read the paper, and look at the beautiful car I had spent years restoring. The park was public space, designed for residents to enjoy. I backed the car carefully into a parking spot, the V8 engine burbling quietly. I hadn't even turned the ignition off when I saw her. A golf cart, the preferred vehicle of petty tyrants everywhere, came zipping across the grass, leaving faint tracks in the morning dew. Clarissa was at the helm, a visor pulled down low on her forehead and a look of grim purpose on her face. She screeched to a halt, blocking my car in. "I thought I made myself clear," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This is not a car show." I took a slow breath, determined to remain calm. "Good morning, Clarissa. I'm just parking my car. I was going to enjoy the park. You know, the way it was designed to be used." She scoffed, a little puff of air that was pure contempt. "That vehicle is a nuisance. It's too loud, it's obnoxious, and it doesn't belong here." This was where the logic broke down entirely. "It's a car," I stated simply, "in a parking lot, in a park." "What exactly is the violation?" She pointed that finger again, the one that would soon be gesturing for the police. "The violation is your attitude, your flagrant disregard for our community standards. I am the president of this association, and I am ordering you to leave. Now." I just looked at her, then at the sprawling park, the walking trails, the beautiful landscaping, every square inch of which I had walked, planned, and approved. A sense of weary determination settled over me. "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't think I will." Her face went through a remarkable series of transformations, from shock to outrage to a smug, vindictive smile. She pulled out her phone. "You're refusing to cooperate with an official of this community. You're creating a public disturbance. I'm calling the police." And she did. Right in front of me, she dialed 911 and reported a hostile, unauthorized individual in a loud, aggressive vehicle trespassing in a private community park. Every word was a lie, a grotesque twisting of reality to fit her narrative of power. And as I sat there, listening to her perjure herself to an emergency dispatcher, I realized my quiet life here was over. But Clarissa had no idea that the war she had just declared was one she had already irrevocably lost. She was playing checkers in a world where I had not only designed the whole board, but I had also written all the rules for chess. The arrival of the police officers was a moment of supreme anticlimax for Clarissa. She had clearly envisioned them arriving in force, perhaps with a SWAT team, ready to drag me from my car in handcuffs. Instead, a single cruiser pulled up, and two officers emerged with the slow, deliberate pace of men who had been pulled away from their morning coffee for something they already knew was nonsense. The senior officer, a man named Miller with salt and pepper hair and a perpetually tired expression, approached Clarissa first. I could hear her animated, high-pitched voice explaining how I was a menace, how I was trespassing, and how I had flagrantly defied her authority. Officer Miller listened with the patience of a saint, occasionally nodding and jotting something in his notebook. His partner walked over to my window, and I preemptively rolled it down. "Morning," he said, giving the Mustang an appreciative glance. "Everything all right, sir?" I gave him a calm smile. "Perfectly fine from my end, officer. Just trying to enjoy the morning." He nodded. "Your neighbor here seems to think you're trespassing on private property." I let out a soft chuckle. "Well, that's where the misunderstanding lies. You see, it's my private property." I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a leather-bound folder. It contained copies of the key documents for the entire Harmony Creek development, the master deed, the plot maps, and my personal identification. I handed them over. The officer took the folder, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He opened it and began to read. His eyebrows slowly climbed his forehead. He walked the folder over to Officer Miller, interrupting Clarissa mid-sentence. I watched as Miller took the documents, his professional weariness replaced by a look of dawning comprehension, followed by a barely concealed amusement. He looked from the papers to me sitting in my classic car, then back to the sputtering HOA president. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now carrying a formal edge, "this gentleman isn't trespassing." Clarissa's face contorted in disbelief. "What are you talking about? This is a private community park, controlled by the Homeowners Association. I am the president." Officer Miller handed the folder back to his partner, who returned it to me with a respectful nod. "According to this master deed, ma'am, the park, the roads, and all common green spaces in Phase 4 of Harmony Creek are still the property of the Development Corporation. They haven't been formally turned over to the HOA yet. This gentleman," he said, gesturing to me, "is the CEO of that corporation. So, technically, you're the one standing on his private property, telling him to leave." The silence that followed was exquisite. You could almost hear the gears grinding in Clarissa's head as her brain tried to process this catastrophic failure of her power play. Her face cycled through a spectrum of colors, finally landing on a mottled, furious red. That's impossible. It's a procedural error." "It doesn't matter. He's still violating the spirit of the rules." Officer Miller held up a hand. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's a civil matter and has nothing to do with us. There's no crime being committed here. In fact, filing a false police report is a misdemeanor. I'd advise you to go home and sort this out through the proper channels." He gave her a long, hard look. With that, he and his partner returned to their cruiser and drove away, leaving Clarissa standing alone in the middle of the parking lot, her authority utterly demolished in front of the handful of residents who had wandered over to see what the commotion was about. Her public humiliation was a palpable thing, hanging in the air like thick smoke. She shot me a look of pure, undiluted hatred before storming back to her golf cart and speeding away. I knew this wasn't the end. I hadn't just embarrassed her. I had challenged her very identity. She would be back, and she would use the only weapon she had left, the HOA itself. The retaliatory strikes began within 48 hours. The first letter was another fine. this time for $200 for creating a hostile environment for a board member. It was utterly baseless, a fiction she had invented out of spite. The next day, another envelope arrived. This one contained a violation notice for an oil stain on the asphalt of the parking spot where my Mustang had been. It claimed I was leaking hazardous fluids on common property. It came with another $100 fine. I walked over to the park and inspected the spot. It was pristine. There wasn't a single drop of anything on the pavement. She was fabricating violations out of thin air. It was a campaign of systematic harassment. This was precisely the escalation I had anticipated. She was so blinded by her fury that she was creating a perfect paper trail of her own corruption and incompetence. My response was methodical. For each violation notice, I drafted a formal, legally precise reply. I didn't use a lawyer's letterhead, wanting to keep my professional resources in reserve for now. I just wrote as a resident, but a very, very well-informed one. I addressed each letter to the Harmony Creek Board of Directors, not just to her. I quoted the specific bylaws she was attempting to weaponize, and then I quoted the articles in the Master Covenant that demonstrated her misinterpretation or outright fabrication. For the hostile environment claim, I simply stated that a third party, the local police department, had been present and determined that no hostility had occurred. For the oil leak, I included a time-stamped, high-resolution photograph of the clean pavement, along with a certified letter from my mechanic attesting that my vehicle was in perfect mechanical condition. I sent every letter via certified mail, requiring a signature upon receipt. I was building my case, brick by painstaking brick. I was establishing a clear, documented pattern of targeted harassment. While she was throwing tantrums, I was forging a weapon. During this time, I decided it was time to talk to my neighbors. I wasn't looking to start a rebellion, just to gather information and see if I was her only target. I started with George, a retired aerospace engineer who lived 2 doors down. He was a quiet man who spent most of his days tinkering with an old Triumph motorcycle in his immaculate garage. I found him polishing a chrome fender. "George," I started. "Got a minute? I wanted to ask about your experience with the new HOA board." He sighed, putting his cloth down. "Clarissa, you mean?" "Yeah, I've had a great experience," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Last month, she fined me because my garbage can was, and I quote, visible for 7 minutes beyond the mandated post-pickup window. 7 minutes. I timed it. He went on to tell me about fines for his garden hose being improperly coiled and for having a non-approved welcome mat. It was the same pattern of petty tyranny. My next stop was Maria, a young lawyer who had just moved into the neighborhood with her family. I caught her as she was getting her mail. When I mentioned the HOA, her eyes rolled so far back I thought she might faint. They sent me a notice because my son's plastic slide in the backyard was a non-permanent structure, visible from the 2nd story of an adjacent property. She told me, exasperated. "It's a 10-foot green plastic slide for a 4-year-old. I read the bylaws she cited. They're meant to prevent people from building shacks or sheds without approval. She's twisting every rule into a pretzel to justify her power trip. Both George and Maria were frustrated, but felt powerless. They were just regular residents trying to live their lives, and the time and energy it would take to fight these things in a formal setting felt overwhelming. They were just paying the ridiculous fines to make her go away. That's when I saw the bigger picture. This wasn't just about me and my car anymore. This was about a community being held hostage. What if we didn't have to fight it? I asked them. What if we could end it? All of it. The looks on their faces, a mixture of hope and skepticism, told me I had my first 2 allies. My quiet war was about to become a revolution. The tipping point came a week later. I received a formal summons in my certified mail. Clarissa and her board, a group of 2 other residents who were clearly intimidated sycophants, had scheduled a special executive hearing. The purpose, according to the letter, was to discuss my ongoing pattern of non-compliance and hostile behavior. The potential penalties listed were severe: a $1,000 fine, a temporary suspension of my rights to use community amenities, including the park I owned, and worst of all, they were threatening to place a lien on my property if the fines weren't paid. This was her big move, her attempt at a public execution to solidify her power. She was going to make an example of me. What she didn't know was that I was more than ready for it. In fact, I was counting on it. I had spent the past week not just responding to her letters, but diving deep into the HOA's corporate structure. Being the founder of the development gave me certain privileges. I still had access to the back-end management portals we used when setting up the initial homeowners association. And in those digital archives, I found the meeting minutes from the past year. I discovered that Clarissa had used an emergency vote with just her and one other board member present to approve a new landscaping contract for the main entrance. The company that won the bid, Prestige Horticultural Designs, had no website and an address that traced back to a P.O. box. A little more digging revealed it was a shell company registered to her maiden name. She was paying herself with HOA funds to install a few extra flower beds. Then I looked into the new community patrol service she'd hired. The patrol car was just an old sedan with a magnetic sticker on the side. The company, Eagle Eye Security, was owned and operated by her cousin. She had turned the HOA into her personal family slush fund. This was more than just harassment. This was likely criminal, but it had to be strategic. A direct accusation without overwhelming, undeniable proof in the right form would just dissolve into a he said, she said argument. I needed a bigger stage. I needed to expose her in front of the entire community, where her power base would crumble beneath her feet. The bylaws she loved to quote were about to become her undoing. I combed through them until I found Article 3, Section 4. The board may hold special executive hearings for rule violations, but any resulting punitive action, including fines exceeding $500 or the placement of a lien, must be ratified by a majority vote at a properly convened general meeting of all homeowners. She couldn't just decree my punishment from her throne. She needed the community to approve it. The annual general meeting was scheduled for the following month. Clarissa clearly planned to hold her kangaroo court, find me guilty, and then ram the ratification through at the big meeting, painting me as a villain who threatened everyone's property values. It was a solid plan, if your opponent was who you thought he was. But her fatal mistake, the one that underpins the downfall of every petty tyrant, was that she had profoundly, catastrophically underestimated her enemy. She thought she was fighting a stubborn resident with a loud car. She had no idea she was fighting the man who had laid the very ground she was standing on. My response to her summons for the executive hearing was a masterpiece of feigned cooperation. I replied via email, confirming my attendance. I adopted a conciliatory tone, writing that I was hopeful we can find a mutually agreeable resolution. This was designed to lull her into a state of supreme overconfidence. I wanted her to walk into that hearing thinking she had already won, that I was coming to beg for mercy. Meanwhile, my allies and I were preparing for the real battle, the general meeting. Maria, with her legal expertise, helped me prepare a meticulous presentation. She reviewed the evidence I had on Clarissa's self-dealing and confirmed it was not only a massive ethics violation, but also likely constituted wire fraud and embezzlement. George, the retired engineer, used his neighborhood connections to discreetly sound out other residents. He compiled a list of more than a dozen homeowners who had been unfairly fined or harassed by Clarissa for equally absurd reasons. They were all angry, but afraid to speak up alone. George convinced them to attend the general meeting, promising them it would be worth their time. My own preparation was focused on a single, powerful document, the Master Deed of Covenants for Harmony Creek Preserve. It was a 150-page behemoth of legalese, a document so dense and boring that I was certain Clarissa had never even attempted to read it. I had spent a decade of my life wrangling with lawyers to perfect that document. It was the constitution of our community, and hidden within its dense paragraphs was a clause I had insisted upon, a failsafe I had built into the very foundation of the community, never imagining I would one day have to use it myself. It was the kill switch. The night of the executive hearing arrived. It was held in the small community clubhouse. It was just me, Clarissa, and her two loyal board members, a nervous-looking man named Frank and a woman who glared at me as if I'd personally insulted her entire lineage. The air was thick with tension. Clarissa sat at the head of the table, presiding like a queen holding court. She read the charges against me in a monotone voice, a laundry list of my supposed sins, from the unauthorized car meet to the fabricated oil leak to my defiance of her authority in the park. She presented her evidence, which consisted of her own angry letters and grainy photos she'd taken from her golf cart. It was a farce, but I let her play it out. I sat there, calm and attentive, occasionally taking notes. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair with a smug smile. "Mr. Alex," she said, her voice dripping with false sincerity, "the board finds this pattern of behavior deeply troubling. We are here to protect the community. What do you have to say for yourself?" This was my cue to grovel, my cue to apologize. Instead, I just gave a slight, polite smile. "Thank you for presenting your perspective, Madam President," I said, my tone even and professional. "I have no defense to offer at this time. I will, however, be preparing a full presentation to share with the entire community at the upcoming general meeting, as is my right under Article 3, Section 4 of the bylaws. I look forward to hearing the voices of all my neighbors on this matter." Her smile faltered. This wasn't part of her script. I wasn't fighting back. I was accepting the escalation to a larger venue. The two other board members exchanged a worried glance. Clarissa quickly recovered. "Fine," she snapped. "Let the record show the accused offers no defense. This board votes unanimously to find Mr. Alex in violation. We will recommend the full penalty, a $1,000 fine, and a property lien for ratification at the general meeting." She banged a tiny gavel on the table, a comical gesture of finality. The hearing was over. I had been found guilty. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt a profound sense of calm. The trap was now perfectly set. Clarissa, in her arrogance, had just handed me the stage, the audience, and the justification for everything that was about to happen. She had publicly scheduled her own execution. All I had to do now was show up and pull the trigger. The night of the Harmony Creek Preserve annual general meeting was unusually well attended. Typically, these events drew a few dozen retirees and the most diligent of residents. But tonight, thanks to George's quiet networking and a general sense of unease percolating through the neighborhood, the main hall of the community center was packed. At least 100 homeowners were crammed into the uncomfortable folding chairs, buzzing with anticipation. I saw the faces of all the people George had told me about. The man fined for his unapproved basketball hoop. The family sanctioned for planting a vegetable garden. The woman reprimanded because her wind chimes were deemed excessively melodic. They were all there. Maria gave me a subtle, reassuring nod from her seat in the front row. I sat near the back, holding a slim leather portfolio. At the front of the room, Clarissa was in her element. She and her two board members sat at a long table, a tableau of self-importance. She opened the meeting with an air of profound gravity, running through the mundane agenda items, the budget report, the landscaping committee update with an impatient tone. It was clear she saw all of this as a mere preamble to the main event, my public humiliation. Finally, she reached the agenda item titled Ratification of Executive Hearing Penalties. Her demeanor shifted. She became somber, theatrical. "And now," she began, her voice resonating with manufactured concern. "We must address a serious internal matter. It is with a heavy heart that the board must bring forward a recommendation for punitive action against a resident, a Mr. Alex, for repeated and willful violations of our community standards." A murmur went through the crowd. She had their attention. She launched into a 10-minute monologue, a masterfully twisted narrative that painted me as a disruptive, disrespectful outlaw. She spoke of my intimidating vehicle, my unauthorized gatherings, and my open defiance of the board's authority. She framed the 911 call as a heroic act she undertook to protect the peace. She portrayed herself as the lone shield standing between the good people of Harmony Creek and the forces of chaos. "The board has voted to levy a $1,000 fine and place a lien upon the property to compel compliance," she concluded, her voice ringing with conviction. "This is about protecting the investment we have all made in this wonderful community. We now ask for the homeowners to ratify this decision. All in favor?" Before anyone could raise a hand, I stood up from the back of the room. "Point of order, Madam President," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to fill the hall. Every head turned to look at me. Clarissa's eyes narrowed. "You are out of order, Mr. Alex. This is a vote, not a debate." I started walking slowly toward the front of the room. "According to your own bylaws, Article 2, Section 7, a homeowner who is the subject of a punitive action has the right to address the assembly before a ratification vote is taken." "I'd like to exercise that right now." Maria immediately stood up. "He is correct," she announced, her lawyerly voice cutting through the tension. "It's right there in the governing documents. He must be allowed to speak." A wave of murmurs confirmed the sentiment. The crowd wanted to hear the other side. Trapped by the very rules she claimed to champion, Clarissa had no choice. With a look of pure fury, she gestured curtly to the podium. "Fine," she spat. "You have 5 minutes." I reached the front of the room and placed my portfolio on the podium. I didn't even look at her. I turned and faced my neighbors. "Good evening, everyone," I began. "My name is Alex. For those of you who don't know me, I live on Oakwood Lane, and Clarissa is right about one thing. I am the man who parked a Mustang in the park. But there's a bit more to the story that I think you all deserve to hear." I paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Before I was a resident here, I was the lead developer for this entire community. My name, or rather, the name of my company, is on every single master deed, including the one that established the Harmony Creek Preserve Homeowners Association. A new, more intense wave of whispers swept through the room. I could see Clarissa's face pale slightly. She knew something was very, very wrong. "I didn't just buy a house here," I continued. "I helped design the very dream of this place. A place for community, for peace, for the quiet enjoyment of our homes and the beautiful amenities around us. An enjoyment which has been under threat lately." I gestured to a small projector I had set up earlier. "If I may direct your attention to the screen." I clicked the button, and the first page of the HOA's annual budget appeared. The one Clarissa had breezed through minutes earlier. "This is the budget you all pay for. Let's look at a few line items, shall we?" I pointed to the landscaping contract. A $30,000 contract awarded for entrance beautification to a company called Prestige Horticultural Designs. What the board failed to mention is that this company is registered to a Clarissa Miller, our president's maiden name. "She paid herself with your money," the crowd gasped. People started talking animatedly among themselves. Clarissa jumped to her feet. "That's an outrageous lie. That's slander." I ignored her and clicked to the next slide. "Or how about our new security contract? A $50,000 annual fee to Eagle Eye Security, a company whose sole proprietor is her cousin, a man who lost his security guard license in the next state over for sleeping on the job." The anger in the room was now a palpable force. George stood up. "She fined me $100 last week for a crooked welcome mat. someone shouted from the back. The room erupted in a chorus of similar complaints. I held up a hand for quiet. "This isn't about welcome mats or garden hoses," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "It's about an abuse of power. It's about a board that has forgotten it serves the residents, not the other way around." Which brings me back to the park. I clicked to my final slide. It was a dense block of legal text from the master deed. I had highlighted one specific section. "This is Article 11, Section 3C of the Founding Covenant of Harmony Creek." I'll summarize it for you. It states that all common areas, including parks, roads, and clubhouses, remain the legal property and under the ultimate jurisdiction of the Development Corporation until 100% of the residential lots are sold and the community is formally signed over to the HOA. As you know, we still have Phase 5 under construction. The community has not been signed over. The park, legally speaking, is still my company's private property. So when President Clarissa called 911 on me for trespassing, she was calling the police on the landlord for sitting in his own living room. Absolute stunned silence. Clarissa had collapsed back into her chair, her face as white as a sheet. She was utterly exposed. Her authority, her lies, her grift, all lay bare for the entire community to see. Therefore, I concluded, my voice ringing with finality, I'd like to make a motion, not to vote on her ridiculous fine, but to vote on a motion of no confidence in the entire current board of directors, effective immediately. The silence was broken by a single person, Maria, who stood up and said, "I second that motion." And then the entire room erupted. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The vote of no confidence wasn't just a vote. It was an avalanche. It was nearly unanimous, with the only nay votes coming from Clarissa and her two now terrified board members. Their reign was over, snuffed out in a public forum of their own making. Clarissa didn't even try to argue. She sat, stone-faced and trembling, as resident after resident stood up to voice their support for the motion, many sharing their own stories of her petty harassment. When the vote was tallied and the result announced, she gathered her things and practically fled the room, avoiding eye contact with the dozens of people she had tormented. The other two board members resigned on the spot, stammering apologies before beating a hasty retreat. The sense of collective relief in the room was euphoric. It felt like a town celebrating the end of a long occupation. In the vacuum left by the old board, an interim board was nominated and approved in a matter of minutes. Maria, with her legal mind, was the obvious choice to lead it. George, with his steady hand and trusted reputation, was also voted in, as was another reasonable resident everyone respected. Their first official act was to unanimously and permanently void every fine and violation notice Clarissa had ever issued. A cheer went up through the hall. My own work, however, was not quite finished. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my firm's forensic accounting department. I told them I was formally requesting a full audit of the Harmony Creek Preserve, HOS financials, exercising my right as the primary stakeholder under the development's founding charter. I knew they would find every penny Clarissa had funneled to herself and her family. The second call was to the county's district attorney, a man I knew professionally from my years of working on zoning and development permits. I didn't make accusations. I simply stated that a routine audit was being performed on an HOA's books due to a resident complaint, and that the preliminary findings suggested a pattern of potential fraud and embezzlement. I told him the full audit report would be on his desk within a week. I never had to see or speak to Clarissa again. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband put their house on the market less than a month later. They sold it at a loss and disappeared. A few months after that, I received a notice in the mail that she had been formally charged with 3 counts of felony embezzlement. The smoking gun had fired true. With the tyranny overthrown, the community began to heal and, more importantly, to actually become a community. Maria and George, leading the new board, drafted a community charter, a simple, common-sense document that reestablished the HOA's purpose, not as a punitive body, but as a facilitator for community well-being. They simplified the rules, eliminated the absurdity, and focused on things that actually mattered, like organizing neighborhood events and ensuring the communal facilities were well-maintained. The atmosphere in Harmony Creek changed almost overnight. People started talking to each other more. The fear of a violation notice for a misplaced garden gnome was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of shared ownership and pride. And as for me, I finally got to enjoy the peace I had sought when I first moved in. About 2 months after the fateful general meeting, I decided it was time to resurrect an old tradition. I posted a notice on the community message board, inviting everyone to the first official Harmony Creek Cars and Community Day at the Central Park. This time, it was different. This time, it was sanctioned, promoted, and celebrated by the HOA. That Sunday morning, the park was filled not just with a handful of classic cars, but with families. Kids ran on the grass. People laid out blankets, and a local coffee shop, now operating in one of the commercial spaces I had designed, had set up a tent serving free drinks. Maria brought her son, who was having the time of his life looking at the engines. George proudly displayed his gleaming Triumph motorcycle. I parked my Mustang in the exact same spot where Clarissa had confronted me. I leaned against its warm fender, a cup of coffee in my hand, and looked out at the scene. I saw neighbors laughing, kids playing, and a genuine, thriving community. All of this was born from a conflict over a place to park a car. It was a stark reminder that sometimes, to build a truly harmonious place, you first have to be willing to tear down the walls that petty tyrants build. You have to fight for your right to simply exist, to enjoy the world you've built, whether that world is a small home, a classic car, or an entire city. And some days, the greatest victory is simply being able to park in peace.